Hi, I wanted to talk about titles. In my experience, it seems like a lot of students treat titles almost as an afterthought. I've had, lots of essays submitted that didn't include a title for the essay at all, and sometimes when they do have titles, they seem as though they're just tacked on at the last minute as a placeholder. Students know that a title should be there, but they don't know what it should contain or what it's really supposed to do. Titles serve an important function for an essay in a couple of different ways. One is that they help to put the audience in a certain mindset from the very beginning, before they even read your introduction. And they kind of hint at what your focus is going to be. If an audience knows that right off the bat, it's going to make it easier for them to understand the decisions you're making in the essay. The other thing is, even if you don't give the audience a ton of information in your title, it can still be helpful in getting the audience interested in your essay and making them want to keep reading. Realistically, as your instructor, I'm going to read whatever you write, but in real life, in the workplace, whatever, the more that you can draw your reader in and make them interested, rather than just writing some generic title, the more they're going to respond to it and be willing to engage with it. So just as an example, at the top of the page here, I put a real-life title of a chapbook from the late 1700s. And a chapbook, they still exist today. Basically, it's a short version of a book, usually like 30, 40 pages long, and it's usually really cheaply made, like just stapled together, essentially. It doesn't look like a typical book. So again, this is a real life title of this chapbook that came out. So let me just read it really quickly. A very surprising narrative of a young woman discovered in a rocky cave after having been taken by the savage Indians of the wilderness in the year 1777 and seeing no human being for the space of 9 years, in a letter from a gentleman to a friend. So I think you can see that a title like this would not work for an essay or a book today. Just would not fly for multiple reasons. But for a very practical purpose, a lot of times around this time period, titles kind of had to be this way, especially for these chapbooks, because the people creating them could not afford to type out a nice description on the back like we see in books today. So again, hopefully you guys read books once in a while and know that on the back or the front cover, there's almost always going to be a nice description of the book or a summary to act as an advertisement to get you to want to keep reading and, potentially buy that book, right? So with chapbooks, in the past, they had to do this in the title, right? So it gives the audience a sense of what the book is about, but the downside of it is that it kind of gives everything away, right? Makes you say, well, what's really the point of reading the book if I get so much of it in the title? So this is not going to work for something written today. The problem, one of many problems is a title like this is obviously way too long. You guys are going to be writing a 5-page essay. When you have something this long, it doesn't fit with the scope of what you're writing. Maybe an even bigger problem, like I just mentioned, is that a title like this gives so much information that there's not really any mystery being created or any incentive to want to read the text itself when you're getting so much information in the title, right? The other thing is, realistically today, people have shorter attention spans than they did in the late 1700s. We're living in this culture where the way that we read is shaped by the internet, and we read in short blurbs. So something this long is just not going to hold somebody's attention, or make them want to continue reading, right? So again, these are things that you need to be thinking about when you're creating a title. What's going to be effective in giving your essay a focus without being too literal or giving everything away? So underneath this top example, I kind of gave a more recent example, right? I'm sure you guys, if you haven't seen the movie It, the newer version that recently came out, that you probably have heard of it or have an idea about what it is, right? And you might say, well, that title it's kind of strange because it could be anything, right? But I don't know. I think a title doesn't have to be long or complicated in order for it to serve a purpose, right? So just as an alternative, what if this movie or book were called Evil Force in Sewer Takes Form of Clown to Prey on Town's Children? That's what the book and movie It are about, right? But I wouldn't want to call a book that, right? It's sort of the same problem as the example above, that I'm giving away too much and there's really no mystery, right? By calling the book It, Stephen King is doing something very clever, right? While it can mean anything, it also makes it creepier, right? And we have associations with that word it. That it almost sounds like it's this thing that can't be named. It's so horrible, right? Which kind of fits with how we're meant to see Pennywise, right? So I don't know. Again, I think that you don't have to make something that's clever or create a pun or do anything like that. It just has to be something that makes the audience say, huh, that's interesting. I wonder where this is going, right? To illustrate this even further, I thought I would show you what the book cover of It looks like. So the only reason I'm kind of taking us here is that, I think when you create a title, you almost want to think of it as an advertisement for the text, just like a book cover is an advertisement for a text, right? So what I have pulled up here are all the different book covers that were used for Stephen King's It. Books come out in multiple editions and they decide to make a new book cover for it, right? So there are a bunch here, that show something about this clown figure that's so central to the book, right? But to me, and again, this is purely my opinion, if I pull this one up, this was the original book cover to It. We don't see the clown image, but to me, this is almost creepier and more interesting. So if you've ever, again, I haven't seen the new version of It, the movie. I've only seen the old version and I've read the book. But, early on in the story, a little boy is kind of lured into the sewer with It because his boat is drifting toward the sewer and Pennywise is sort of drawing him to him. So in this picture, we see that boat and we see sort of these claws coming out of the sewer, right? Nothing about the clown, but again, it's like what's not shown that's creepier than what is shown in some cases, right? So again, I think this is kind of like an interesting choice for this book cover. Just to give you maybe another example, pulled up another book cover here. Maybe some of you are familiar with the book 1984, also turned into a movie. And it's about this futuristic society where everyone is under surveillance all the time. They're being monitored by the government and controlled, ultimately. If they step out of line and do something wrong, then the government's going to come in and essentially imprison them or destroy them. So if you look at all these book covers of 1984, most of them are very simple. They almost all have this eye image, right? And again, that very quickly gets across this idea, this main idea of the story, that this is a story about being watched, what it's like to be under surveillance, right? So I think, a lot of these images use that eye to kind of convey that, right? I always kind of like this image too, where this person's in the spotlight and kind of being held prisoner, kind of frozen in his tracks, right? I think that's part of the point of that story too. So again, the reason why I bring this up is that just as a book cover does that, it's meant to capture the audience's attention and get the central point of the book across in an immediate way. That's what a title should really do too, as much as you can. So let me pull up my document here again. So when you guys are working on your titles for your literary analysis, I think what I would do is consider what seems to be the main point that you're going to discuss in your interpretation. So, like I mentioned in the learning activity and like it's mentioned in your textbook, a lot of times you may have to wait until you've already written the essay to figure out what that title is going to be. Because, as you go through the process of writing the essay, that idea might change. So once you figure out what that is, like what you're going to focus on in your interpretation, that should probably make its way into your title. So, I again put an example up here. Let's take this poem, The Road Not Taken, that you guys were supposed to read for last week. A very generic, boring title would be something like Literary Analysis of The Road Not Taken. That doesn't really tell the audience what you're going to be looking at. It could be anything about that text. So I think what you want to do is hint at what your focus is really going to be. So I put a few different examples up here. And again, it just kind of depends on what you're going to be talking about in your analysis. So this first one, I said, diverging roads and different lives in Frost's The Road Not Taken. If I were going to be looking at that central image of the two roads that this speaker has to choose from, maybe something like this would hint at really what I'm going to be discussing later in the essay. Something else I could say is Frost's point of no return, memory and regret in The Road Not Taken. Because again, something important he talks about is this impossibility of taking both roads that he wants to, right? And, he's imagining that he's going to regret this later in his life, that he didn't take this other road. I used it in this example and the next one too, but a really common thing to do is use a colon to kind of separate your title. So this last example that I gave, The Road That Made No Difference, Misinterpretations of Meaning. So again, a very common reading of that poem is that the speaker takes the road less traveled, and it made a big difference in his life. But I think there are also clues in that poem that suggest that the speaker's only imagining that he's going to think it made a big difference. So again, maybe you're going to talk about a way that people have misinterpreted the text that you're discussing. Maybe this is the way that you could let the audience know that, right? So again, try to go beyond the literal when you're creating a title. create some mystery and ultimately make your audience want to keep reading what you've written.